A millionaire on the brink of death used his last fortune to buy an elderly woman who was being auctioned off by her own grandson and took her home. Days later, when checking the mansion's cameras, he broke down in tears at what he saw the elderly woman doing. Ellsworth Hargrove's mansion stood as a monument to solitude that Thursday morning, its 23 empty rooms echoing only the sound of tired footsteps from a 72-year-old man who had traded love for money longer ago than he cared to remember. The Italian marble that covered the floor reflected the cold dawn light as Ellsworth slowly descended the main staircase, each step a battle against the searing pain that pierced his head like white-hot needles, the same pain that had been tormenting his nights for months, but which his stubborn pride refused to investigate. "Doctors are for the weak, and I am not weak," he muttered to himself, gripping the banister with enough force to turn his knuckles white. Marigold had been in the kitchen for over an hour preparing breakfast when she heard her employer's dragging footsteps approaching. 15 years of serving this man had taught her to recognize every nuance of his mood by the sounds he made. And today, something was definitely wrong. She observed discreetly while pouring coffee into the Chinese porcelain cup, noticing how his hands trembled as he tried to hold it, the hot liquid dangerously swaying near the edge as he struggled to maintain control over his own movements. "Are you all right, sir? Shall I call a doctor?" she asked with a voice laden with genuine concern, knowing she would probably receive a harsh response. Ellsworth raised his tired eyes to Marigold, irritation burning through the haze of pain that clouded his vision, and with an abrupt gesture of his hand, he dismissed her as one would shoo away an inconvenient fly, spilling half the coffee onto the white linen tablecloth in the process. He had neither time nor patience for her concern, not when contracts were waiting for his signature, deals to close, more money to be accumulated in accounts already overflowing with a fortune he had no one to share with. "I don't need any doctor, I need you to leave me alone," he growled, his voice hoarser than usual as he abruptly rose from the table. Marigold stepped back, well acquainted with that tone of voice after all these years, knew that insisting would be futile and would probably result in shouting or even dismissal, something she couldn't afford to lose at her 60 years of age. She silently watched as Ellsworth walked toward the hallway leading to his office, noticing how he discreetly leaned against the wall when he thought she wasn't looking, how his normally firm steps now seemed uncertain, almost stumbling. "I'll prepare your lunch for noon, Mr. Hargrove," she said softly, more to herself than to him as he was already disappearing into the dark corridor. Ellsworth's office was his sanctuary, the only place in the mansion where he truly felt in control, surrounded by stacks of contracts, spreadsheets, documents that represented his real estate empire built over decades of relentless negotiations and cold decisions. But that morning when he sat in his Italian leather armchair, the letters on the documents before him began to dance like drunken ants, multiplying and dividing in a nauseating waltz that made his stomach churn. He rubbed his eyes hard, blinked several times, tried to focus, but the pain in his head exploded with such intensity that he had to bite his lip to keep from screaming. "This will pass, it always passes," he whispered to himself, reaching for the Mont Blanc pen with fingers that suddenly seemed made of gelatin. The pen slipped from his fingers as if it had a life of its own, rolling across the mahogany desk and falling to the floor with a sound that echoed in the silence of the office like a gunshot. And when Ellsworth leaned over to pick it up, the whole world decided to spin in opposite directions at once. He grabbed the edge of the desk with both hands, knuckles white as exposed bone, breathing heavily as waves of nausea rose up his throat, threatening to explode at any moment, his entire body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Not now, please, not now," he begged the universe, his voice nothing more than a hoarse whisper as he tried to rise from the chair. But his body, that same body that had carried him through 72 years of life, decided it had reached its limit, and when Ellsworth tried to stand, his legs simply gave way as if someone had cut invisible strings that supported them. The collapse was sudden, and he fell to the floor without strength, the sound echoing throughout the mansion. "Marigold, help!" He tried to shout, but his voice came out as a pathetic whisper that barely reached his own ears. Lying on the cold floor, Ellsworth could see the phone on the table just a few meters away, but it might as well have been on another continent, given the impossibility of reaching it with his body that refused to obey the desperate commands from his brain. His right hand extended tremulously toward the device, fingers dragging across the polished marble in spasmodic movements that resembled the final gasps of a fish out of water. Each centimeter gained an epic battle against the paralysis overtaking his limbs. I can't die like this, not alone, he thought, panic finally breaking through the walls of pride he had built over decades. Ellsworth's peripheral vision began to darken, as if someone were slowly closing black curtains around his field of view, reducing the world to an ever smaller tunnel where only the unreachable phone remained in focus, mocking his helplessness. His lips moved frantically, trying to form words, screams, any sound that might attract attention, but all that escaped was a hoarse whisper that barely disturbed the oppressive silence of the office, as if even his voice had decided to abandon him in this crucial moment. Cordelia, Anna, forgive me, he mumbled, the names of his dead wife and daughter emerging from some deep place in his consciousness. Time lost all meaning as Ellsworth lay there on the cold floor. It could have been minutes or hours, he couldn't tell. His world reduced to the throbbing pain in his head and the growing desperation of knowing he was completely alone in his agony. He could hear the ticking of the wall clock, each second dragging like an eternity, marking what could very well be the countdown to his end, and the irony of dying surrounded by so much luxury and solitude did not go unnoticed by his mind, struggling to remain conscious. All this money and it can't even buy help, he thought bitterly, a hysterical laugh trying to escape but dying in his dry throat. Marigold finished cleaning the kitchen and looked at the clock on the wall. It was already past noon, and Mr. Hargrove hadn't responded when she announced lunch was ready, something very unusual for a man who lived by the rigid routine he had established. She climbed the stairs slowly, her knees protesting after years of ascending and descending those same steps, calling out loudly as she approached the office, concern growing with each unanswered step. Mr. Hargrove, lunch is served, she announced as she knocked on the solid oak door, expecting to hear the usual grumpy response. The silence from the other side of the door was deafening, different from the normal silence of the house. It was a heavy silence, laden with something that made all the hairs on her neck stand up in a terrible premonition. She knocked again, harder this time, calling his name with growing urgency, her hand already on the latch while her heart raced in her chest like a caged bird trying to escape. Mr. Hargrove, I'm coming in, she warned, turning the doorknob with hands that were beginning to tremble. The scene Marigold found upon opening the door would be etched in her memory for the rest of her days. Ellsworth was on the floor, severely debilitated. My God, Mr. Hargrove, what happened? She screamed, hands trembling as she tried to feel his pulse. Marigold's fingers frantically searched for signs of life in Ellsworth's neck, finding only a weak and irregular pulse that resembled a distant drum beating its final rhythm, and she immediately knew that every second counted if she wanted to save him. With fingers that seemed to have a life of their own, they trembled so much. She pulled the cell phone from her apron pocket and dialed the emergency number, her voice breaking as she tried to explain the situation to the operator on the other end, words tripping over one another in her urgency. Please send an ambulance now, he's dying, she begged, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. The emergency service operator asked questions that seemed endless as Marigold held Ellsworth's cold hand, feeling life slipping away from him like sand between fingers. And when she heard that the ambulance would take at least 20 minutes to arrive due to traffic, she made a decision that went against all protocols. There's no time to wait. The traffic in this city will kill him, she said more to herself than to the operator, hanging up the phone and looking at her employer's inert body with fierce determination. I won't let you die here, she promised, already mentally calculating how she would manage to drag him to the car. Marigold didn't know where the strength that possessed her at that moment came from. Perhaps from the same place mothers find strength to lift cars when their children are in danger. But she managed to drag Ellsworth's body down the hallway, each meter conquered with sweat and determination. Her arms screamed in protest. Her back threatened to give out at any moment, but she continued pulling, pushing, dragging, tears mixing with the sweat running down her face while she muttered broken prayers. Don't die, Mr. Hargrove, please don't die, she repeated like a mantra, as if the words could keep him anchored to this world. The descent down the stairs was a nightmare of epic proportions. Marigold had to practically embrace Ellsworth, to prevent him from rolling down the steps, using her own body as a shield while descending each step with infinite care, her legs trembling under their combined weight. With each conquered step, she felt as if she had climbed a mountain, sweat soaking her clothes, breath coming out in desperate gasps. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, not when his life depended on her perseverance. Just a little more, she encouraged herself, finally reaching the ground floor. The garage seemed miles away as Marigold dragged Ellsworth down the main corridor, leaving behind the polished marble she had buffed that very morning, now marked by the trail of her desperate steps. The silver Mercedes was parked in its usual place, the keys hanging on the board next to the door, and Marigold had never driven such a luxurious car, but there was no time for hesitation or fear, only action. "We'll make it, mister. Hargrove, we'll get to the hospital," she said, more to convince herself as she opened the vehicle's rear door. Placing Ellsworth on the back seat was like trying to move a mountain with her bare hands, every muscle in Marigold's body screaming in protest as she pushed, pulled, maneuvered the inert body into the car, sweat dripping into her eyes and blurring her vision. When she finally managed to settle him on the seat, she paused for a second to catch her breath, looking at his pale face and realizing with horror that she could barely see his chest rise and fall with breathing. "Hold on, we're going now," she whispered, rushing to the driver's seat on wobbly legs. The Mercedes engine purred to life with a smoothness that absurdly contrasted with the chaos of the moment, and Marigold gripped the steering wheel with hands that shook so much she had to take several deep breaths before she could engage the gear. She had learned to drive decades ago, but had never driven in an emergency, never with a life literally depending on her skill at the wheel, and the weight of that responsibility almost paralyzed her. "Cordelia and Anna, if you're up there, help him," she prayed aloud, stepping on the accelerator. The city streets transformed into a blur as Marigold drove like she had never driven before, honking frantically, running red lights without hesitation, cursing other drivers with words she didn't even know she knew. The Mercedes responded to each command with surgical precision, weaving between cars like a metal snake, and Marigold mentally thanked Ellsworth for keeping the car always in perfect condition, even though he would never know that this maintenance would save his own life. "I need to get through, it's an emergency," she shouted at a truck blocking the way, bypassing it via the sidewalk without thinking twice. The hospital finally appeared on the horizon like an oasis in the desert, and Marigold floored the accelerator for the last few meters, the car skidding to a stop at the emergency entrance as she was already shouting for help before even turning off the engine. Nurses and doctors rushed toward the car like an army of angels in white, pulling Ellsworth from the back seat with practiced efficiency, transferring him to a gurney while someone already began chest compressions. "How long has he been like this?" asked a grey-haired doctor as they rushed inside. Marigold tried to follow the gurney while answering questions stumblingly, her legs shaking so much she could barely walk straight after all the adrenaline began leaving her system. "I found him on the floor about 15 minutes ago. I don't know how long before that he fell," she explained, her voice hoarse from shouting. "Please, save him. That's all I ask," she begged when the emergency room doors closed in her face. On the other side of the glass separating the waiting room from the emergency room, Marigold could see the frantic ballet of doctors and nurses working on Ellsworth's body, hands moving with practiced precision, voices shouting instructions she couldn't understand. The cardiac monitor was visible from where she stood, the green lines rising and falling in erratic patterns that even she, without medical knowledge, could tell were not normal. "He's stubborn. He won't give up easily," she muttered to herself, hands clasped in prayer. A young doctor connected wires to Ellsworth's chest, while a nurse inserted a thick needle into his arm, and Marigold could see blood being collected in several tubes as another professional prepared a machine she didn't recognize. "We need to stabilize him before doing the CT scan," shouted the grey-haired doctor, who seemed to be in charge. "Prepare 2 ampules of adrenaline," she ordered, and Marigold saw how her hands moved with absolute confidence. The cardiac monitor began to beat more slowly, the green lines spacing further apart, and Marigold saw controlled panic take over the medical team as they intensified their efforts. The doctors tried to resuscitate him urgently, while Marigold watched with a heavy heart, unable to bear the tension of the moment. The lines on the monitor began to flatten, the space between peaks growing larger until there were only occasional small ripples interrupting the almost straight line, and Marigold saw the chief doctor look at the clock on the wall. "Time of arrest, 12:43, she began to say, but was interrupted by another doctor. "Wait, there's something here on the electro," he said, pointing to the screen. The tension in the room was palpable even through the glass, all eyes fixed on the monitor, as those small ripples struggled to become something more, as if Ellsworth's heart was waging its own private war against death. "One more ampule of adrenaline," ordered the doctor, and Marigold could see the cautious hope in her eyes. "Come on, Mr. Hargrove, fight," Marigold murmured, pressing her hand against the glass. But then, as if all the forces keeping Ellsworth anchored to this world had finally been exhausted, the monitor stopped registering signals, and silence took over the room. Marigold saw the doctor's shoulders fall in defeat, saw her gesture for them to stop compressions, saw a nurse turn off the monitor alarm, transforming the room into a sepulchral silence. "Time of death," the doctor began, looking at the clock. Marigold's mind refused to process what she was seeing, her brain rejecting reality, as if it were a nightmare from which she could wake up at any moment. But the silence in that emergency room was deafening in its finality. She saw the medical team begin to disperse, some removing gloves, others disconnecting equipment, all with that expression of professional defeat that comes from losing a battle against death. "No, this can't be happening," she murmured, her legs giving way. Marigold slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold hospital floor, tears flowing freely now as she processed the fact that she had failed, that despite all her superhuman efforts, it hadn't been enough to save Ellsworth. 15 years serving that difficult man, 15 years of silent mornings and lonely afternoons, and now it would end like this, with her watching him leave through a glass wall. "Forgive me, Mr. Hargrove, I tried," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. The hospital corridor was empty except for Marigold and her grief, the sound of her sobs echoing off the white, sterile walls as she cried not just for Ellsworth, but for all the loneliness she had witnessed, all the wasted love, all the lost opportunities for reconciliation. She thought about calling someone, but realized with a deep sadness that she knew no one to call, no friends, no relatives. Ellsworth had built walls so high that even in death there was no one to mourn him besides her. "What a waste of life," she murmured between tears. A nurse approached gently, touching Marigold's shoulder with professional compassion, probably to ask about emergency contacts or funeral arrangements, but she had no answers to give. How to explain that this rich and powerful man would die with no one to claim his body except a housekeeper? "Does he have family?" asked the young nurse in a soft voice, and Marigold just shook her head negatively. Marigold rose slowly, her legs still trembling, and walked to the glass to take one last look at Ellsworth, now partially covered by a white sheet, his face finally at peace after so many years carrying the weight of guilt and remorse. She placed her hand on the glass as a silent farewell, remembering all the times she had seen glimpses of humanity behind that hard facade, fleeting moments when he looked at that hidden photo. "Rest now, Mr. Hargrove," she whispered, turning to leave. It was then that Marigold heard the most unlikely sound, a shout coming from inside the emergency room, followed by a frantic rush of footsteps and agitated voices, and when she turned around, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The grey-haired doctor had rushed back into the room, shouting orders while the team regrouped around Ellsworth like bees returning to the hive. "We have a pulse. Weak, but there's a pulse," someone shouted, and Marigold felt her legs almost give way again, but this time from relief. The heart monitor, that same monitor that had shown the flat line of death, now displayed small irregular peaks, as if Ellsworth's heart had decided to give one last chance to life, one last opportunity for redemption. The doctors worked with renewed energy, reinserting tubes, reconnecting machines, injecting medications, each movement precise and urgent as they fought to stabilize that unlikely miracle. "Prepare the operating room," ordered the chief doctor, and Marigold knew the battle was far from over. Marigold pressed her face against the glass, watching every movement of the medical team with desperate attention, memorizing every detail to be able to tell Ellsworth when he woke up, because now she was certain that he would wake up. That stubborn and proud man would not give up so easily, Not when there was still so much to be resolved, so much forgiveness to be sought, so much life still to be lived. "You're going to make it," she murmured. "You have to make it." The stretcher began to move, doctors and nurses pushing it quickly toward the elevator, while keeping Ellsworth connected to various portable machines, and Marigold had to run to keep up, her old shoes slipping on the hospital's waxed floor. "Where are they taking him?" she asked breathlessly to a nurse who stayed behind. "Emergency surgery, Ma'am," he replied. "Are you a relative?" he asked, and Marigold hesitated for only a second. "I'm the only family he has," Marigold replied with conviction. And it wasn't a lie, not really, because after 15 years caring for that impossible man, she was the closest thing to family that Ellsworth Hargrove had. The nurse nodded understandingly and guided her to the surgery waiting room, a place even more sterile and impersonal than the emergency corridor. "It may take hours," he warned kindly before leaving. Marigold sat on the hard plastic chair, her body finally beginning to feel the weight of everything she had done, every muscle screaming in protest. But she didn't care about the physical pain, not when Ellsworth was still fighting for his life some floors above. She pulled the rosary from her pocket, the beads worn from constant use over the years, and began to pray with a fervor she hadn't felt since her own mother was sick. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners," she murmured, the familiar words bringing some comfort. The hours dragged like molasses as Marigold waited, the clock on the wall marking each second with cruel precision, and she lost count of how many bad coffees she drank from the vending machine, how many times she walked down the corridor, how many prayers she whispered to the silence. Other patients and families came and went, each with their own tragedy, but Marigold remained a solitary sentinel waiting for news. "He's strong. He's always been strong," she repeated to herself when fear threatened to overwhelm her. It was almost midnight when the grey-haired doctor finally appeared, her face exhausted but not defeated, and Marigold stood up so quickly that she had to lean on the chair to keep from falling. "He survived the surgery," were the doctor's first words, and Marigold felt the air return to her lungs as if she had been holding her breath for hours. "But," the doctor continued, and that small word carried the weight of the world. "We found something during the surgery," explained the doctor, her voice professional but gentle, like someone accustomed to giving bad news. "A brain tumor. It's in an advanced stage and the location makes any intervention very difficult," she continued, and Marigold felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "How long?" asked Marigold, her voice no more than a hoarse whisper. "It's difficult to say with precision. It could be weeks, it could be months. Each case is different," the doctor replied, and Marigold could see genuine compassion in her tired eyes. "He's stable now, but the next 24 hours are critical," she explained. "You can see him briefly if you'd like," the doctor offered, and Marigold nodded vigorously. Ellsworth looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, connected to so many machines that Marigold could barely see where the man ended and the technology began. But he was alive, his chest rising and falling regularly, and that was all that mattered at that moment. She approached cautiously, as if a sudden movement might break the spell keeping him anchored to life, and gently touched his hand, surprised to find it warm. "I'm here, Mr. Hargrove," she whispered, squeezing his fingers gently. The heart monitor maintained its constant rhythm, no longer the terrifying flatline from before, but also not the strong, regular rhythm of a healthy heart. It was something in between, as if Ellsworth were suspended between two worlds, undecided about which path to follow. Marigold pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, determined to keep vigil, to be the anchor that would keep him in this world. "You have to wake up," she said softly. "You still have so much to resolve." The early morning hours dragged on in silence, except for the constant beeping of the machines and the occasional whisper of nurses checking vital signs, and Marigold remained awake, holding Ellsworth's hand and telling stories to the silence. She talked about the 15 years she had worked for him, about the small moments of kindness he probably didn't even remember, about how she had always known that behind all that hardness was a broken man who just needed a second chance. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Marigold was almost dozing off when she felt it, an almost imperceptible squeeze of her hand, so slight it could have been imagination. But then it happened again, stronger this time, and she lifted her head to see Ellsworth's eyes moving beneath his closed eyelids. "Mr. Hargrove?" she called softly, hardly daring to breathe, and then, like the sun breaking through stormy clouds, Ellsworth Hargrove opened his eyes, confused and disoriented, but undeniably alive. "Welcome back," said Marigold, tears streaming down her smiling face. Ellsworth's eyes opened for only a fraction of a second before closing again, as if the effort of returning to the world of the living was too much for his ravaged body to bear. Marigold felt her heart violently accelerate, hope and terror mixing in equal parts, as she squeezed his hand more firmly, as if she could anchor his soul back to his body through that simple touch. The nurse on duty dropped the clipboard she was holding and ran to the hallway, her footsteps urgently echoing against the cold hospital floor as she shouted for help. The heart monitor began to emit a different sound, no longer the constant reassuring beep, but something erratic, jumping from rhythm to rhythm as if it didn't know which path to follow. Marigold looked at the green screen above the bed and saw the lines rising and falling chaotically, drawing mountains and valleys that made no sense to her untrained eyes, but clearly signified danger. "Mr. Hargrove, stay with me," she said with a trembling voice. "Can you hear me?" Ellsworth didn't respond. His eyelids remained closed, but now his entire body began to tremble slightly, a tremor that quickly intensified until the entire bed was shaking with the spasms. Marigold released his hand and backed away, frightened, as the nurse came running back with 2 doctors behind her. The first doctor, a tall man with graying hair and a severe expression, quickly assessed the situation with trained eyes that absorbed every detail in seconds. He checked Ellsworth's pupils with a small flashlight, pulling the eyelids up unceremoniously, as the strong light invaded those eyes that had barely returned to seeing the world. The nurse was already adjusting the tubes and wires connected to Ellsworth's body, her hands moving with mechanical efficiency, born of years of experience in emergency situations. The second doctor, younger and visibly nervous, was checking the monitors and noting numbers on his clipboard with slightly trembling hands. Marigold was leaning against the wall, her fingers pressed against her mouth to contain a sob that threatened to escape, watching the scene unfold before her as if she were watching a horror movie. The older doctor turned to the nurse with an expression that Marigold couldn't decipher, something between concern and determination. "We need to call Dr. Cordelia immediately," he said in a controlled but urgent voice. "Something is very wrong here." The nurse was already on the phone before he even finished his sentence, and Marigold felt her stomach churn as she realized the situation was even worse than she had imagined. Minutes that seemed like hours dragged on as they waited for the head of neurology to arrive, and during all this time, Ellsworth remained in that borderline state between being conscious and unconscious, his eyes moving frantically under closed eyelids, as if he were having a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Marigold didn't take her eyes off him, memorizing every detail of that face she had known for 15 years, but which now seemed to belong to a stranger, so pale and vulnerable it was. She remembered how he was when she started working for him, a 57-year-old man still full of vigor and determination, always walking quickly through the mansion corridors with firm and sure steps. Now lying in that hospital bed surrounded by machines that breathed and pumped for him, Ellsworth seemed to have aged decades in a matter of days. The tremor in his body had diminished, but not completely ceased, small occasional spasms making his fingers contract and his muscles jump under the skin. Marigold wanted to get closer, wanted to hold his hand again and tell him everything would be all right, but the doctors blocked her way and she dared not interrupt their work. "Please God, don't take him now," she muttered quietly. "Not when he has just returned." The unit door opened forcefully, and a woman in a white coat entered hurriedly, her face showing a mixture of determination and something deeper, something personal. Dr. Cordelia Ashford was 42 but looked younger, her still youthful face framed by black hair, tied in a firm bun that didn't let a single strand escape. She walked directly to Ellsworth's bed, without even looking at the others present in the room, her eyes fixed on the monitors, while her mind processed information at surprising speed. Marigold observed how the doctor checked Ellsworth's pupils again, how her fingers felt the pulse in his neck, how she tilted her head slightly as she listened to his breathing through the stethoscope. There was something in Dr. Cordelia's posture that conveyed not only professional competence, but also an emotional urgency that seemed to go beyond medical duty. The older doctor began to report the observed symptoms, using technical terms that Marigold didn't understand, but which sounded serious from the intonation of his voice. Cordelia interrupted him with a brusque hand gesture, her eyes never ceasing to examine Ellsworth as she absorbed the information. Suddenly, she turned to the nurse with an expression that made everyone in the room straighten up. "I saw his initial tests when he arrived yesterday," Cordelia said firmly. "There was an anomaly that worried me, something that didn't match with a simple collapse." She took the chart from the younger doctor's hands and quickly leafed through the pages, her eyes scanning the data with impressive speed. "Where are the CT scan images?" she asked, and the tone of her voice left no doubt that this was not a casual question. The younger doctor quickly connected a tablet to the system and brought the CT scan images on screen, and Cordelia approached, studying each slice, each angle, each shadow in the black and white images of Ellsworth's brain. Marigold saw the doctor's face gradually close, her eyebrows furrowing as she enlarged certain areas of the image and compared them with others. The other doctors also approached, looking over Cordelia's shoulder and exchanging worried glances among themselves. The silence in the room became oppressive, broken only by the beeps of the monitors and the heavy breathing of everyone present. Cordelia continued studying the images for a few more minutes that seemed to stretch infinitely, and Marigold felt her legs begin to weaken under the weight of accumulated tension. Finally, Cordelia lowered the tablet and turned to face Ellsworth again, and there was something in her eyes that Marigold had never seen before in a doctor, a mixture of fierce determination and personal pain. "This is not just a collapse," said Cordelia, her voice controlled but loaded with contained emotion. "There's something else happening here, something that needs to be treated immediately, or we'll lose him." She turned to the older doctor and gave quick, precise instructions, using terms that Marigold didn't understand, but that were clearly urgent based on how everyone began to move rapidly. The room exploded into renewed activity, nurses rushing to fetch medications and equipment, while doctors positioned themselves around Ellsworth's bed like soldiers preparing for battle. Marigold was gently but firmly led out of the room by the same nurse who had shouted for help minutes earlier, and she found herself on the other side of the glass door, watching everything through the window with her heart in her throat. She could see Cordelia coordinating the team with precise gestures, her mouth moving quickly as she gave orders that everyone obeyed without question. The older doctor was beside Ellsworth, preparing a syringe while another nurse adjusted the tubes in his throat. The younger doctor monitored the screens, noting every change in vital signs with intense concentration. Marigold pressed her hands against the glass, leaving vapor marks around her fingers as her accelerated breathing fogged the cold surface. She wanted to scream, wanted to punch them and demand that they save him, wanted to do something besides just standing there watching helplessly. But all she could do was observe and pray as she hadn't prayed in years, pray with an intensity that made her chest hurt. "Don't let him die," she whispered to the glass. "Please don't let him die alone as he lived." A tear ran down her face and she didn't even bother to wipe it away. Inside the room, Cordelia was bent over Ellsworth with an expression of absolute concentration, her fingers carefully feeling along his skull while she muttered something to herself. The older doctor approached her, and Marigold saw his lips move, probably questioning what she was doing, but Cordelia completely ignored him and continued her meticulous examination. Suddenly she stopped, her fingers pressed against a specific point on Ellsworth's right temple, and her expression subtly changed. She took the small flashlight from her coat pocket and illuminated Ellsworth's eyes again, but this time she was looking for something specific, something only she knew what it was. Marigold saw when Cordelia found what she was looking for, saw how her entire body stiffened, and how she quickly turned to the nurse with renewed urgency. "We need to do an MRI immediately," said Cordelia, her voice loud enough for Marigold to hear through the glass. "I can't wait until tomorrow, it has to be now." The older doctor began to protest, pointing at the clock and probably reminding her that it was almost 4 in the morning and that the radiology team wasn't on call. Cordelia turned to him with an expression that accepted no arguments. "Then wake them up," she said with a firmness that bordered on rudeness. "This man doesn't have until tomorrow." The discussion intensified, Marigold could see the older doctor's agitated gestures and Cordelia's inflexible posture. Could see the younger doctor trying to intervene and being ignored by both. The nurse was on the phone again, probably trying to contact the radiology team, while two other nurses continued monitoring Ellsworth and adjusting the equipment. Marigold felt a wave of gratitude for Cordelia, this woman she didn't know, but who was clearly fighting tooth and nail for Ellsworth's life. There was something in Cordelia's determination that went beyond professionalism, something personal and profound that Marigold recognized because she herself felt something similar. Perhaps it was because both had seen something in Ellsworth worth saving, something beyond the bitter and closed-off man he showed to the world. Or perhaps Cordelia had her own reasons, her own demons that made her fight so fiercely for every life that passed through her hands. Marigold didn't know, and at that moment it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was fighting for him. Someone besides her refused to let him go without a battle. "Thank you," murmured Marigold to the glass, knowing that Cordelia couldn't hear her but needing to say it anyway. "Thank you for not giving up on him." Inside the room, Cordelia had won the discussion and was already giving new instructions to prepare Ellsworth for transport. The next 20 minutes were a blur of movement and frantic activity, with the medical team disconnecting Ellsworth from some equipment and connecting him to portable versions, preparing him for the journey through the hospital corridors to the radiology department. Marigold followed them at a respectful distance, her steps echoing lonely as she walked behind the stretcher, carrying Ellsworth surrounded by doctors and nurses. The hospital corridors at 4 in the morning had a surreal quality, the fluorescent lights creating harsh shadows and the almost total absence of people giving the place an atmosphere of abandonment. Marigold passed by closed doors of rooms where other patients slept or suffered in silence, passed by empty nursing stations where only 1 or 2 staff members on duty raised their heads to observe the urgent procession passing by. She thought about how strange it was that life and death happened in these sterile corridors, that moments of indescribable joy and devastating tragedy occurred side by side, separated only by thin walls. Ellsworth was being taken to discover something. Marigold knew this from Cordelia's urgency, and she was afraid of what that discovery might be. But she also knew that not knowing would be worse, that uncertainty was a different kind of torture. "Whatever it is, we'll face it," she thought, trying to convince herself of a courage she didn't completely feel. "We've been through too much to give up now." The radiology department was dark when they arrived, only emergency lights providing weak, ghostly illumination that made the enormous machines seem even more intimidating. Girl's sleepy technician arrived 5 minutes later, clearly annoyed at having been woken in the middle of the night, but becoming more alert when he saw the seriousness on Cordelia's face. She spoke with him in a low voice, explaining what she needed, and Marigold saw the technician nod understandingly and begin to prepare the equipment. The MRI machine was a huge white cylinder that looked capable of swallowing a whole human being, and that's exactly what happened when Ellsworth's stretcher was carefully positioned and slid into the opening. Cordelia entered the control room with the technician, leaving a nurse outside with Marigold. Through the glass window, Marigold could see Cordelia leaning over the computer screen, her eyes fixed on the images that began to appear as the machine hummed and clicked in its work. The process seemed to take forever, each minute dragging as if time itself had decided to slow down and torture Marigold with the waiting. She tried not to think of the worst, tried not to imagine all the terrible things those images might reveal. "He's alive," she reminded herself. "Still breathing, still fighting, that has to count for something." But fear continued to gnaw at her insides like a hungry rat. When the machine finally stopped and Ellsworth was removed from inside the white cylinder, Cordelia was still in the control room, studying the images with an intensity that made the air around her seem to vibrate. The technician was talking to her, pointing to different parts of the images on the screen, and Marigold saw Cordelia nod while making quick notes on a pad. The older doctor had arrived too, joining them in the control room, and now the three were in an intense discussion that Marigold couldn't hear through the soundproof glass. Ellsworth was taken back to the intensive care unit room, and the nurse gently suggested that Marigold go home and get some rest, that they would call if there was any change. But Marigold firmly shook her head. There was no possibility of her leaving now, not when they were about to discover what was happening. She sat in an uncomfortable chair outside the room and waited, her hands folded in her lap, as she watched through the window Ellsworth lying motionless surrounded by machines. The sky outside the hospital windows gradually began to lighten, the deep black of night giving way to the bluish grey that precedes dawn. Marigold observed the change of light with tired eyes, thinking how appropriate it was that this moment of transition in Ellsworth's life would happen during the transition between night and day. "Which path will you choose?" she thought, looking at him. "Will you stay with us or will you move on?" She didn't know the answer, and that terrified her. Cordelia left the control room almost an hour later, her face showing deep exhaustion, but also something more, a renewed determination that made Marigold immediately stand up from her chair. The doctor walked directly to her, holding a folder with the printed images from the MRI, and there was a gravity in her expression that made Marigold's heart dangerously accelerate. They sat together in the uncomfortable seats, and Cordelia opened the folder on her knees, revealing black and white images of Ellsworth's brain that looked unintelligible to Marigold, but clearly told a story to the doctor's trained eyes. Cordelia took a deep breath before speaking, as if preparing to carry a very heavy weight. "Ms. Marigold, I need to be completely honest with you about what we found," said Cordelia, her voice professional but not cold. "There isn't much we can do to help this man." "This patient's brain tumor is inoperable, ma'am," Cordelia said calmly, "and by its appearance and location it's aggressive and in an advanced stage." Marigold's world seemed to violently tilt to one side, and she had to hold on to the chair arms to keep from falling. Cordelia's words continued coming, explaining about the tumor's location in the frontal lobe, about how it was pressing on critical areas of the brain responsible for motor and cognitive functions, about how it had probably grown silently for months or even years, causing symptoms that Ellsworth probably ignored or attributed to other causes. Marigold listened but could barely process, her mind still stuck on those first devastating words. Brain tumor, advanced stage. The implications of these words were so enormous that she couldn't fully grasp them. Cordelia continued explaining treatment options, talking about palliative radiotherapy and chemotherapy and symptom management. But Marigold realized by the way she spoke that she wasn't mentioning a cure, because cure wasn't an option. The tumor was inoperable, in a position that made any surgery impossible without destroying vital functions, and treatments could only slow the inevitable, not prevent it. Cordelia remained seated beside her in silence for several minutes, not trying to comfort her with empty words or false promises, just being present, while Marigold absorbed the devastating reality. When Marigold finally opened her eyes again, she saw that Cordelia was looking at Ellsworth through the window with an expression that revealed more than she probably intended. There was pain there, an old and deep pain that Marigold recognized because it was similar to her own. "You lost someone this way?" Marigold asked softly. "Is that why you're fighting so fiercely for him?" Cordelia didn't answer immediately, her eyes still fixed on Ellsworth as she clearly debated with herself about how much to share. Finally she sighed and turned to face Marigold. "My father," said Cordelia, her voice heavy with contained emotion. "2 years ago he had a sudden collapse at home, alone. Nobody found him for hours." She paused, swallowing with difficulty, and Marigold saw the shine of unshed tears in her eyes. "When he reached the hospital, it was already too late. His brain had gone without oxygen for too long. He never woke up," Cordelia continued. "He died 3 days later without ever knowing I was there, that I rushed back from a conference in another state as soon as I knew." Marigold reached out and held Cordelia's hand, reversing the roles of comforter and comforted. "I'm sorry," said Marigold sincerely, and Cordelia nodded in acknowledgement. They sat like that for a few more minutes, two women united by the pain of loving difficult men and the determination not to let them go without a fight. Finally, Cordelia stood up, discreetly wiping her eyes and regaining her professional composure. "I'll speak with Mr. Hargrove when he's more stable," she said. "He has the right to know about the diagnosis and decide how he wants to proceed." Marigold agreed, knowing it was right, but dreading the conversation, dreading seeing the hope fade from Ellsworth's eyes when he found out. Cordelia began to walk away, but then stopped and turned again. "Ms. Marigold, you're the only person who came with him, the only person who stayed here all night," she said. Doesn't he have anyone else? Marigold shook her head sadly. Not that I know of, she replied. In 15 years working for him, I've never seen a friend visit, never answered a call from a relative, never received correspondence from anyone other than lawyers and accountants. Cordelia nodded understandingly. He's lucky then, she said. Lucky to have at least you. Many die completely alone. She walked down the corridor and disappeared, leaving Marigold alone again with her thoughts and fears. The day had fully dawned, sunlight entering through the hospital windows and illuminating the corridors with a brightness that seemed cruel in its normalcy. Marigold watched nurses changing shifts, doctors making their morning rounds, cleaning staff pushing carts, visitors beginning to arrive carrying flowers and balloons. Life continued normally for all those people, while Ellsworth's world had just collapsed without him even knowing it yet. Marigold thought of all the things he would never do, all the places he would never visit, all the conversations he would never have. She thought about the huge empty mansion waiting for him, the unsigned contracts on his desk, the fortune he had accumulated that he couldn't take with him. What a waste, she thought. What a terrible waste of a life. But then she remembered the moment he woke up, the light squeeze of his hand, the recognition in his eyes when he saw her. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps in the weeks he had left, he could find some redemption, some peace. Marigold knew she would do everything in her power to help him, even if it meant just being there, being the witness to his final days, so he wouldn't die completely alone. We'll get through this together, she murmured to Ellsworth through the glass. I won't let you face this alone, I promise. The promise echoed in the silent air, a solemn vow made on the threshold between life and death. The following days merged into an exhausting routine of vigil and waiting, with Marigold adamantly refusing to leave the hospital for more than the few hours necessary to shower and change clothes in the empty mansion. She always rushed back, as if afraid Ellsworth might depart in her absence, leaving her alone with the weight of an unsaid farewell. The intensive care unit had strict rules about visiting hours, but the nurses had developed a silent sympathy for this woman who clearly loved the patient more than he probably deserved, and they turned a blind eye when she stayed beyond what was allowed. Ellsworth remained in a semi-conscious state, waking briefly only to fall again into a deep sleep that seemed to drain all his strength, as if his body was waging an internal battle between living and giving up. Marigold observed each breath, each movement of his fingers, each contraction of his facial muscles, looking for signs of improvement or deterioration with the obsessive attention of someone who had nothing left but this vigil. Cordelia appeared 3 times a day to check vital signs and adjust medications, always with that professional expression, but laden with something deeper, something personal that Marigold had learned to recognize. "How is he today?" Marigold would ask every time, and Cordelia would respond with technical details that she mentally translated into hope or despair. "Stable," Cordelia would frequently say. "But stable doesn't mean improving, it means he's holding the line between the two sides." Marigold nodded, understanding perfectly what that meant. On the 3rd night after the diagnosis, Marigold was sitting in the chair next to Ellsworth's bed, when she noticed his eyes were open, not that confused and disoriented opening from before, but a more focused gaze that seemed to really be seeing the world around him. She leaned in immediately, her heart racing as she searched for signs of real consciousness in those eyes she knew so well, but that now seemed different, more vulnerable and frightened. Ellsworth tried to speak, but his throat was dry and irritated from the tubes that had been removed only a few hours earlier, and all that came out was a hoarse sound that seemed more like a groan of pain. Marigold quickly grabbed the cup of water with a straw that the nurse had left and brought it to his mouth, gently holding his head while he took a few small sips. The cool liquid seemed to help, because when he tried to speak again, the words came out clearer, though still weak and slurred. "Where am I?" he asked, and there was so much fear in that voice that Marigold felt her heart breaking. "What happened to me?" She held his hand with both of hers, squeezing gently while carefully choosing her words, knowing that what she said now would shape how he faced everything that would come next. "You're in the hospital," she said softly. "You collapsed at home, do you remember?" Ellsworth closed his eyes, clearly trying to access memories that seemed slippery and out of reach. He remained silent for so long that Marigold thought perhaps he had fallen asleep again. But then his eyes opened and there was something in them she had never seen before. Something that looked suspiciously like unshed tears. "I remember falling," he said slowly, each word clearly requiring effort. "I remember the floor coming toward my face. I remember not being able to scream. I remember thinking I was going to die alone in my office, and nobody would know for hours." His voice failed on the last word, and he turned his face to the side as if ashamed to show emotion in front of her. Marigold squeezed his hand harder, not letting him hide behind that mask of indifference he had worn for so many years. "But you didn't die," she said firmly. "I found you in time, managed to bring you here, and the doctors saved your life." Ellsworth looked at her again, and there was so much gratitude in his gaze that Marigold had to blink rapidly to contain her own tears. "You saved my life," he said. It wasn't a question, but a statement loaded with admiration and confusion. "After 15 years of me being a terrible boss, after all the times I was rude and cold, you still cared enough to save me." Marigold smiled through the tears that now fell freely. "Because beneath all that hardness, I always knew there was a good man," she said, "a man who was suffering but who still deserved to be saved." Ellsworth closed his eyes again, and this time the tears escaped, running down the corners and wetting the pillow beneath his head. They remained like this for several minutes, united by the comfortable silence of two people who had finally torn down the walls between them, and Marigold realized that this was the most intimate moment she had shared with another person in years. Finally, Ellsworth opened his eyes and looked around the room, taking note of the equipment, the monitors, the tube still connected to his body. "How long have I been here?" he asked, and Marigold could see his mind trying to calculate, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. 5 days, she answered, observing his reaction carefully. "You were in a coma for 3 days, then briefly woke up but fell back asleep, and now you're truly awaking for the first time." Ellsworth processed this information in silence, and she could see the fear growing in his eyes as he connected the dots. "I'm very sick, aren't I?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't just a simple collapse, it was something worse. Marigold felt a knot form in her throat, knowing this was the moment she had feared, the moment when she would have to decide whether to tell the truth or wait for Cordelia to do it. But looking at those frightened yet determined eyes, she knew he deserved the truth from her, not from a stranger in a white coat. "Yes," she said simply. "It is something worse, but we'll talk about it when Dr. Cordelia comes. She can explain better than I can." Ellsworth nodded, accepting the response but clearly not being satisfied with it, and Marigold saw his hands tighten on the sheets in anxiety. Cordelia appeared less than an hour later, having been called by the nurse who noticed that Ellsworth was finally fully conscious and alert. She entered the room with that confident posture of an experienced doctor, but Marigold noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way she took a deep breath before approaching the bed. Ellsworth watched her enter with cautious eyes, already prepared for bad news by the grave expression on her face. Cordelia pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, placing herself at the same level as Ellsworth, instead of standing in a position of authority, and Marigold recognized that gesture as a sign of respect and empathy. "Mr. Hargrove, my name is Cordelia Ashford. I'm the head of neurology at this hospital," she said calmly. "How are you feeling now?" Ellsworth studied her for a moment before responding. "Confused, scared, and with a constant headache," he said honestly, "but mostly scared because I know something is very wrong with me." Cordelia nodded, appreciating his frankness. "You're right," she said, deciding that direct honesty was the best approach. "Something is very wrong and I need to explain what we found." She opened the folder she had brought and showed the MRI images to Ellsworth, pointing to the dark area that Marigold already knew well. "This is an image of your brain," Cordelia explained, "and this spot here is a tumor, specifically a glioblastoma, which is an aggressive type of brain cancer." The words fell into the room like heavy stones, and Marigold saw all the color drain from Ellsworth's face. The silence that followed was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the constant beeping of the monitors that now seemed louder and more intrusive than before. Ellsworth stared at the image, his mind clearly trying to process what those words meant, trying to understand how his life had changed so drastically in a matter of days. Marigold saw his hands begin to tremble, and she covered them with hers, offering the only comfort she could. Cordelia waited patiently, giving him time to absorb the initial information before continuing with the devastating details. Finally, Ellsworth raised his eyes from the images and looked directly at Cordelia. "How long do I have?" he asked, his voice surprisingly firm considering the circumstances. "Please don't spare me. I need to know the truth." Cordelia held his gaze, respecting his courage. "With aggressive palliative treatment, including radiotherapy and chemotherapy to control growth and manage symptoms, we're talking about 3 to 6 weeks, she said calmly. Without treatment, probably less than 2 weeks. Ellsworth closed his eyes, and Marigold saw a muscle in his jaw twitch as he struggled to maintain his composure. "And surgery?" he asked, still keeping his eyes closed. "Is there no possibility of removing the tumor?" Cordelia slowly shook her head. "The location makes it impossible to operate without destroying critical brain functions," she explained. "You would be left in a vegetative state or die on the operating table. There is no third option." Ellsworth opened his eyes again, and now tears fell freely without shame or attempt to hide them. 72 years, he said after a long moment, his voice choked with emotion. 72 years, and the last 25 of them wasted in bitterness and self-imposed solitude. He looked at Marigold with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to remain steady. 25 years punishing myself and everyone around me for something I cannot change, he continued. And now, when I finally realize how much I've wasted, I discover I have no time to fix anything. Cordelia leaned forward, her expression changing from professional to something more personal. "Mr. Hargrove, may I speak not as your doctor, but as someone who understands loss?" she asked, and when Ellsworth nodded, she continued. "My father died 2 years ago in a manner very similar to your collapse, alone and without time for goodbyes," she said, her voice laden with contained emotion. "I've spent the last 2 years wondering if he knew I loved him, despite all our distance, wondering if he died thinking he was alone in the world." She paused, discreetly wiping away a tear that had escaped. "But you still have time," she said firmly. "Weeks may not seem like much, but they're more than many have. They're enough to make the peace that needs to be made, to say the words that need to be said." Ellsworth observed her with renewed interest, seeing for the first time the person behind the doctor, and something in his expression softened. "And if there's no one to make peace with?" he asked bitterly. "What if I pushed away all the people who might have cared about me?" Marigold squeezed his hand harder. "You have me," she said with conviction, "and that's already something." Cordelia stayed a few more minutes explaining details about palliative treatment, about the symptoms Ellsworth could expect as the tumor progressed, about the medications that would help with pain and other discomforts. Ellsworth listened in silence, asking occasional questions, but mostly just absorbing information that was difficult to process but necessary to understand. When Cordelia finally stood to leave, she placed her hand gently on Ellsworth's shoulder. "I'll leave you to talk," she said, "but I want you to know I'll do everything in my power to ensure your final weeks are as comfortable as possible. You have my word." Ellsworth nodded in gratitude, clearly too emotional to speak. Cordelia looked at Marigold, and the two exchanged a look of understanding. Two women united by their determination not to let this man face his end alone. "I'll be back early tomorrow to start the treatment protocol," said Cordelia, "but if you need anything before then, don't hesitate to call me." She left the room, leaving a heavy silence in her wake, and Marigold and Ellsworth were alone again, each lost in their own thoughts about mortality and wasted time. "Marigold," Ellsworth finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something I've kept for 25 years that's been eating me up inside." Marigold adjusted herself in the chair, preparing to hear whatever he needed to share. Ellsworth closed his eyes, and when he began to speak, his voice was laden with the weight of decades of unprocessed guilt and regret. "I had a family once," he said, "a beautiful wife named Cordelia, yes, same name as the doctor, and a 7-year-old daughter named Anna, who was the most precious thing that ever existed in this world." Marigold remained silent, barely daring to breathe as he finally opened that closed chapter of his life. "We were returning from a birthday party for one of Anna's friends," he continued, his voice beginning to tremble. "I made a grave mistake by leaving a party with my wife and daughter, drove in conditions I shouldn't have. I had been reckless, and the accident changed everything forever," said Ellsworth, finally verbalizing the thought that had poisoned his soul for 25 years. Because of my arrogance, my stupidity, my belief that I was above the basic rules of safety, I destroyed the two most precious lives I ever touched. He turned his head to look at Marigold, his eyes red and swollen. How does one live with that? He asked desperately. How do I wake up every day knowing I'm here and they're not because of me? Marigold didn't know what to say. There were no words that could fix or ease that pain, so she simply held his face between her hands and let him cry, deep and torn sobs that came from a dark place that had been locked away for too long. She held him while 25 years of guilt and pain finally found an outlet, while he released everything he had kept, repressed behind walls of bitterness and isolation. You cannot change what happened, she finally said when the sobs subsided, but you can choose how you live the time you have left. You can choose to honor their memory by living in a way that would make them proud, instead of punishing yourself to death. Ellsworth looked at her with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. How? He asked simply. How do I do that when I've already wasted so much time? Marigold thought carefully before answering. By starting now, she said. Starting today, in this moment. Choosing to be the man they loved instead of the man guilt created. Ellsworth nodded slowly, as if he was beginning to glimpse a possibility that seemed impossible before. The following days brought subtle but significant changes in Ellsworth, as if finally sharing his heaviest burden had freed something inside him that had been trapped for decades. He began palliative treatment with Cordelia, radiotherapy sessions that left him exhausted and nauseated, but promised to control the tumor growth for a few precious weeks. Marigold was by his side at each session, holding his hand when waves of nausea hit him, talking to him about small and insignificant things to distract him from the discomfort. Ellsworth began asking questions about Marigold's life, real and interested questions, not just superficial politeness, and she found that she enjoyed sharing stories about her own life, about her children who lived far away, about her late husband, about her dreams and regrets. It was strange and wonderful at the same time. 15 years working for someone, and only now really beginning to know him as a person. A week after the diagnosis, Cordelia declared Ellsworth strong enough to be discharged on the condition that he continue treatment as an outpatient and maintain constant medical care at home. You need a full-time nurse, Cordelia explained. Someone trained to monitor your symptoms and administer medications, Marigold immediately offered. I'll learn, she said firmly. Teach me what I need to know, and I'll take care of him. Cordelia hesitated, concerned if it would be asking too much from a housekeeper, but seeing the determination in Marigold's eyes, she agreed. I'll arrange an intensive course in palliative care for you, said Cordelia, and I'll visit daily to check how things are going. Marigold nodded, ready to assume any necessary responsibility. He won't die alone, she said with conviction, not if I can help it. Cordelia smiled, a genuine expression of admiration and gratitude. He is lucky to have you, she said. The return to the mansion was strange for both of them, as if they were seeing the place with new eyes after everything that had happened. Marigold helped Ellsworth slowly climb the stairs, his body still weak and unstable, and settled him in the master bedroom instead of the office where he had spent so much time before. She opened the heavy curtains that had been closed for years, letting sunlight in to illuminate the space that had become dark and oppressive. Ellsworth sat on the edge of the bed and looked around as if he were seeing the room for the first time, noticing details he had ignored for decades. Cordelia decorated this room, he said softly. She spent hours choosing colors and fabrics, wanted it to be perfect. He touched the quilt with trembling fingers. I closed this room after the accident, he continued. I couldn't come in here without seeing her in every corner, so I simply locked the door and slept in the guest room for 25 years. Marigold sat beside him, respecting the vulnerability of the moment. And now? She asked gently. Can you be here now? Ellsworth thought for a long moment before answering. Now I can see that I was wasting not only my present, but also their memories, he said. I was turning something beautiful into something painful when I should have been honoring the love we had. He lay down carefully on the bed, clearly exhausted by the effort of returning home. I want to spend my last days here, he said, surrounded by their memories, finally allowing myself to remember the love instead of just the loss. Marigold adjusted the pillows under his head. Then that's exactly what we'll do, she said with a smile. "We'll fill this place with life again before it's too late." Ellsworth closed his eyes, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in so long that Marigold almost didn't recognize the expression. That night, after ensuring that Ellsworth was sleeping comfortably, Marigold went down to the office where it all began. She looked at the stain on the marble floor where he had fallen, now cleaned but still visible if you knew where to look. She walked to the imposing desk, covered with papers and contracts, silent witnesses to a life dedicated to accumulating wealth at the expense of human connections. She began to search, not knowing exactly what she was looking for until she found it, a locked drawer on the side of the desk that she had never noticed before. Marigold searched for the key, checking every drawer and compartment, until finally finding it hidden inside an old pen holder. Her hand trembled slightly when she unlocked the drawer and opened it, revealing its long hidden contents. Inside was a single silver frame turned face down, as if Ellsworth couldn't bear to see it, but also couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. Marigold carefully turned it over and saw what he had hidden for all those years. The photograph showed a much younger Ellsworth, his hair still dark without white strands, smiling broadly with his arms around a beautiful brown-haired woman and a small girl with braids holding a melting ice cream. They were at the beach, the sun shining behind them, and the happiness in the image was so palpable that Marigold felt her heart tighten. "Cordelia and Anna," she whispered, gently touching the image. "You were beautiful, and he loved you so much that he almost destroyed himself with the loss." She held the photo against her chest for a moment, making a silent promise to those two women she would never meet. "I'll take care of him," she murmured. "I'll make sure his last days are full of the love you would have wanted him to have, I promise." The full moon shone through the office window, illuminating the photograph in her hands with an ethereal silvery light that seemed almost magical. Ellsworth decided to walk a little, to go out and enjoy his last days seeing the city at night. Marigold had protested, worried about his fragile state, but he insisted that he needed it, needed to feel alive while he still could. The city at night pulsed with an energy he had forgotten during his years of isolation. Ellsworth walked slowly through the streets, leaning on his cane, each step a struggle against the weakness consuming him, but also an affirmation that he was still there, still existed. He needed to feel life one last time before it was too late. Night workers hurried past toward bus stops, their faces tired but determined. Young couples strolled hand in hand, occasionally stopping for stolen kisses under the trees. Street vendors offered food, whose smell made his stomach turn but also reminded him that he was still alive, that he could still feel. All of it, life pulsing around him, was a painful and beautiful reminder of everything he had wasted in the last 25 years. Turning a corner, he came to a square poorly lit by old lampposts that occasionally flickered. There were wooden benches worn by time and use, and Ellsworth walked gratefully toward the nearest one, desperately needing to rest before the journey back home. He sat down heavily, each muscle screaming with relief, and closed his eyes for a moment, just enjoying the cool night breeze. It was then that he heard agitated voices and a commotion coming from the other side of the square. A small crowd had formed around an improvised stage made of precariously stacked crates. A young man of no more than 30, wearing a suit that had once been good but now showed signs of wear, held a cheap microphone connected to a crackling speaker box. His voice came out loud but broken, carrying poorly disguised desperation. "I need to find someone to take care of my grandmother," he shouted to the crowd that was forming more out of morbid curiosity than genuine interest. "I can't manage anymore. I have enormous debts, loan sharks chasing me. I can't support her anymore." Ellsworth stood up with effort and slowly approached, leaning heavily on his cane, each step requiring concentration. The people moved slightly aside to let him pass, making space for the old man. When he finally managed to see what was happening, Ellsworth felt his stomach turn. An elderly woman was sitting in a white plastic chair next to the young man, head down as if trying to disappear, silent tears running down her wrinkled face and falling onto her lap, where her hands were interlaced so tightly that her knuckles were white. She made no sound, neither pleading nor protesting, just existing there in complete humiliation. "Delphine is 79, healthy despite her age, doesn't cause trouble," the young man continued, his voice rising an octave in panic. "I'm even willing to pay someone to take her care for her, anything. I just can't do this alone anymore." He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, his eyes desperately scanning the crowd looking for someone, anyone, who might be the solution to his problem. The crowd reacted cruelly, as crowds often do when protected by the anonymity of the group. "Who's going to want to take care of an old woman like that?" said a middle-aged man with evident contempt in his voice, provoking nervous laughter from others. "At her age, she's nothing but expense," commented a woman beside him, shaking her head as if evaluating defective merchandise. "Hospital, medicine, doctor, who wants that kind of problem?" A teenager filming everything with his phone moved closer and laughed loudly. "She should be in a nursing home, not here putting on this ridiculous spectacle," he said directly to Delphine, his youth making the cruelty even more shocking. Delphine shrank further into the chair, trying to disappear, to become invisible through sheer force of will, and Ellsworth saw more tears run down her already soaked face. Something inside him, something that had been dormant for 25 years since the accident that killed Cordelia and Anna, finally awakened. It was anger, yes, but it was also deep empathy and a burning desire to do something, to not just be another passive spectator of human cruelty. That grotesque scene, that public humiliation of someone who should be protected and honored for her age and experience, awakened something he thought had died along with his family. "Enough," he muttered to himself, "enough of watching without doing anything." He stepped forward, planting his cane firmly on the ground. "I'll take her," said Ellsworth, his voice cutting through the air like a blade through thin fabric, louder and firmer than any voice he had used in years. The silence that followed was absolute, all conversations ceasing instantly, as all heads turned to locate the source of that impossible declaration. Everyone turned, surprised, looking at that old man leaning on a cane who had materialized out of nowhere to intervene. Ellsworth took another step forward, ignoring how his legs trembled, ignoring the throbbing headache, focusing only on reaching that shattered woman. "I'll pay you to let me take her away from here," he said, looking directly at the young man on the improvised stage. "I'll remove her from this humiliating situation right now." The young man blinked several times, confused, his mouth opening and closing without sound, as he tried to process what he was hearing. "Are you serious, sir?" he finally asked, his voice coming out tremulous, mixing incredulity with desperate hope. "You really want to take her?" Ellsworth nodded slowly, his determination unwavering despite the exhaustion that threatened to knock him down at any moment. "Completely serious," he said, beginning to take his cell phone from his coat pocket with fingers that trembled slightly. "I've never been more serious in my life. Now give me your bank account." His voice left no room for discussion or hesitation. With trembling hands that almost dropped his own cell phone, the young man dictated the bank account numbers, repeating them twice to ensure Ellsworth understood correctly. Ellsworth typed carefully, verifying each number before proceeding, aware that a mistake could complicate everything. He reached the amount screen and paused only briefly, before typing a generous sum, much more than would be necessary to cover the debts the young man had mentioned. But Ellsworth didn't care about the amount. He only cared about getting Delphine out of that situation as quickly as possible. "Confirm transfer," he read aloud for everyone to hear. With no possibility of reversal or cancellation, he pressed the button with final decision. The young man's phone beeped almost immediately, the deposit notification cutting through the tense silence that had fallen over the square. He looked at the screen, his eyes progressively widening as he processed the amount that appeared there, and then looked again, as if he couldn't believe it, as if he expected the numbers to change or disappear. "It's here," he whispered, his voice full of admiration and shock. "It really is here, all the money." He looked at his grandmother one last time, and Ellsworth saw something pass across his face. Perhaps shame, perhaps relief, perhaps both mixed in equal proportions. The young man mumbled something that could have been an apology or justification, or simply farewell. And then he was running, descending from the improvised stage and through the crowd that opened to let him pass, disappearing into the night with the cell phone pressed against his chest, as if it were the only thing that mattered in the world. The crowd began to disperse quickly, people murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some still filming, others already typing on their phones to share the story on social media. In less than 2 minutes, the square was almost empty. only a few curious people remaining at a distance to see what would happen next. Ellsworth put the phone in his pocket and walked slowly toward the improvised stage, each step requiring renewed concentration as the adrenaline began to diminish, leaving only deep exhaustion and a headache that throbbed behind his eyes. He climbed the 2 steps formed by the crates with extreme difficulty, almost losing his balance, but recovering at the last moment by gripping his cane as if it were an anchor. When he finally stood in front of Delphine, he needed a moment to catch his breath before he could speak. She was still sitting in the plastic chair, but now she had raised her head and was looking at him with an expression of complete confusion and fear. Ellsworth extended his free hand toward her, keeping the other firmly holding the cane that was the only thing keeping him standing. "Come, ma'am," he said as gently as he could, his voice coming out hoarse but carrying genuine sincerity. "Let's go home, to a safe place where no one will humiliate you or treat you as a burden." Delphine looked at that outstretched hand as if it were a strange and potentially dangerous object, her mind clearly struggling to process everything that had happened in the last impossible minutes. Her tears had stopped, but the tracks still glistened on her cheeks under the dim light of the lampposts, and her blue eyes, tired and full of pain, studied Ellsworth with almost physical intensity. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice so low and broken that Ellsworth had to lean dangerously to hear, risking losing his balance. "Why would you do this for me? Why would you pay for a stranger who is worth nothing?" Ellsworth felt his heart break with those words, with the way she saw herself, reduced to nothing by circumstances and by the betrayal of those who should protect her. He didn't answer immediately, taking his time to choose the right words, knowing that what he said now would shape everything that came after. "Because I saw you," he finally said, his voice loaded with emotion that came from a deep and long-locked place inside him. "Really saw you as a person, as a human being with dignity and inherent worth, not as a burden or problem to be solved." He paused, swallowing the knot in his throat. "And because no one deserves to be treated like this," he continued, "no one deserves to be publicly humiliated, have their dignity destroyed by cruelty or someone else's desperation." Delphine continued looking at him, searching for signs of falsity or ulterior motives, and seeming genuinely confused when she found none. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, she hesitated briefly and then, very slowly, like a flower opening after a long winter, extended her hand and placed it in his. Delphine remained motionless for a few more seconds that seemed to stretch infinitely, her blue eyes still studying Ellsworth's face as if trying to read in the lines of expression and tired features whether this man was her salvation or just another trap disguised as kindness. Finally, with a slow and hesitant movement like someone who had been hurt so many times that each gesture required renewed courage, she extended her trembling hand and placed it in Ellsworth's. The touch was light at first, almost imperceptible, as if she were ready to pull back at the first sign of danger, but then Ellsworth's fingers closed gently around hers with a firmness that conveyed protection without threat. He helped her rise from the plastic chair, feeling how her body was too light, too fragile, as if she hadn't eaten properly in weeks or perhaps months. Delphine's legs trembled when she stood, and Ellsworth had to hold her elbow with his free hand to stabilize her, his cane working hard to keep them both balanced. "We can go slowly," Ellsworth said gently, beginning to guide her away from the improvised stage. "There's no rush. We have all the time in the world." Delphine nodded silently, her eyes still moist but the tears had stopped falling, replaced by an expression of stunned shock that made her seem distant and disconnected from reality. They descended the 2 steps formed by crates with extreme caution, every movement coordinated between 2 fragile bodies supporting each other, and the few people who still remained in the square watched in respectful silence. "I'll call a taxi," said Ellsworth when they finally reached the sidewalk. "I'm in no condition to drive, and I imagine you aren't either." Delphine just nodded again, seeming to have completely lost the ability to speak. The taxi arrived 15 minutes later, during which time Ellsworth and Delphine remained standing next to a lamppost, neither of them trusting enough in their own strength to sit on one of the square's benches. Ellsworth had called Marigold briefly just to say he was fine, and coming home, ignoring her frantic questions about where he had been and why he had taken so long. He helped Delphine into the back seat of the taxi, then got in beside her with difficulty, each movement requiring careful calculation to avoid losing balance or dropping his cane. The driver, a middle-aged man with the tired face of someone who has worked night shifts for too many years, looked at them through the rearview mirror with poorly disguised curiosity, but had the good sense not to ask questions. Ellsworth gave the address of the mansion and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as waves of exhaustion and throbbing pain in his head hit him with renewed force now that the adrenaline was subsiding. Delphine remained huddled in the opposite corner of the seat, her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture, occasionally casting quick, furtive glances in Ellsworth's direction, as if still trying to understand what had happened and what would happen next. The journey was completely silent, except for the sound of the engine and nighttime traffic, neither knowing what to say to the other, each lost in their own turbulent thoughts. "All my liquid assets," thought Ellsworth, opening his eyes slightly to look out the window at the passing city lights. "I gave everything without thinking twice. Cordelia would be proud or think I'd gone completely mad." He smiled slightly to himself, deciding it would probably be a bit of both. The mansion appeared at the end of the tree-lined street as it always did, imposing and majestic with its white columns and perfectly maintained gardens, but this time Ellsworth saw it through Delphine's eyes and realized how intimidating and even threatening it must seem to someone in her situation. Marigold was waiting at the front door before the taxi had completely stopped, having heard the sound of the engine coming up the circular driveway, and Ellsworth could see even from a distance the expression of concern mixed with relief and also confusion when she noticed he wasn't alone. He paid the driver with the cash he still had in his wallet, gave a generous tip, and then got out of the car with renewed difficulty, his legs violently protesting against all the night's exertion. Delphine exited from the other side and stood beside the taxi as if unsure whether to follow or flee, her eyes wide as she absorbed the magnitude of the house that rose before her. Marigold descended the entrance steps quickly, her hands already gesturing in maternal concern. "Mr. Ellsworth, you worried me too much. You disappeared for hours. I was about to call the hospital," she said, her voice laden with equal parts recrimination and relief. "You know you're not well, that you shouldn't go out alone like this." She stopped abruptly when she finally focused properly on Delphine, noticing the pitiful state of the elderly woman with wrinkled clothes and a face still marked by tears. "Who is this lady?" asked Marigold, her voice immediately softening with genuine concern. "What happened?" Ellsworth sighed deeply, knowing that the explanation would be complicated and would probably result in more questions than answers. "Marigold, this is Delphine," said Ellsworth simply, deciding that details could wait until he was inside and seated. "She will be living with us, and before you ask, no, it's not temporary, it's permanent." Marigold blinked several times, processing this information that made no sense considering that Ellsworth had never allowed anyone besides her to live in the mansion in all 15 years she had worked there. "Living with us," she repeated slowly. "You mean as a temporary guest while she recovers from something?" Ellsworth shook his head firmly. "No, Marigold, as a permanent resident of this house, with all the rights and privileges that implies," he said, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "Prepare the second-floor guest room, the one overlooking the garden, the one with the private balcony." Marigold opened her mouth to protest or question, but then saw something in Ellsworth's expression that made her stop, something that suggested this was important in ways she didn't yet understand, but should respect. "Yes, sir," she finally said, turning to Delphine with a warm smile despite her confusion. "Ma'am, please come with me. I'll prepare your room and bring clean towels and fresh clothes." Delphine didn't move. Her feet seemed to have grown roots on the sidewalk. Ellsworth noticed the fear still present in her eyes, the terror that this might be some kind of elaborate trap. "Mrs. Delphine," he said, his voice assuming a gentleness that Marigold had never heard him use in 15 years, a kindness that came from a deep and newly discovered place. "You are safe here, I promise." Delphine looked at him, searching for signs of lies or malice and finding none. "How can I trust that?" asked Delphine, her voice breaking slightly. "How do I know you won't hurt me, or use me, or sell me to someone else?" Ellsworth felt each word like a stab. understanding that his own grandson's betrayal had completely destroyed her ability to trust in apparent kindness. He thought carefully before responding, knowing that what he said now would shape their entire future relationship. "You cannot know for certain," he said honestly. "There is nothing I can say now that would prove my intentions. Only actions over time can do that." He paused, gathering strength to continue. "But I can say this, I don't need a maid. I already have Marigold. I don't need company because I've spent 25 years deliberately avoiding it. And I certainly don't need complications when I'm dying," he said, each word carefully chosen. "What I need is to do something good before I go, something that Cordelia and Anna would have approved of, something that justifies all the wealth I've accumulated but never used for anything but building walls around myself." Delphine studied his face for a long moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, something in her posture relaxed slightly. "Who are Cordelia and Anna?" she asked quietly, and Ellsworth felt tears stinging his eyes again. "They were my family," he said simply, "and I lost them through my own stupidity, but that's a story for another day, when we're both less exhausted." He gestured toward the house. "Please come in, take a hot bath, put on clean clothes, eat something, sleep in a comfortable bed, and tomorrow we can talk more if you want," he said. "And if you decide to leave tomorrow, no one will stop you. But at least you will have spent one night with dignity." Delphine looked at the mansion, then at Marigold, who was still waiting patiently, and finally back at Ellsworth. "Just this one night then," she said, "and tomorrow we'll see." Ellsworth nodded, knowing it was the most he could hope for right now. Marigold led Delphine inside, while Ellsworth followed them slowly, each step of the entrance a mountain to be climbed. Inside, the mansion was illuminated with that soft light that Marigold always left on when she knew he would be out at night, and Ellsworth felt a wave of gratitude for this woman who took care of him so well, despite him never having deserved such dedication. Marigold guided Delphine up the stairs to the second floor, talking softly about mundane things like the shower water temperature and where to find extra towels, clearly trying to make the frightened woman feel more comfortable. Ellsworth went to the living room and let himself fall heavily into his favorite armchair, exhaustion finally completely overtaking him now that he was home and Delphine was safe. He closed his eyes and allowed his mind to wander over the events of the night, about the horrible scene in the square, about the moment he decided to intervene, about the feeling of transferring all his liquid assets without hesitation or regret. "What have you done, you old fool?" he muttered to himself. But there was no regret in his voice, only a kind of stunned admiration for his own audacity. Gave everything, absolutely everything, for a stranger. But even as he thought this, he knew it wasn't true, not completely. Because Delphine was no longer a stranger, she was a mirror of his own loneliness and pain, and saving her was somehow saving himself. Cordelia would have done the same, he thought. Remembering the wife who always saw people instead of statistics or problems, she would have seen Delphine and tried to help, even if it meant participating in something detestable that treated a person like merchandise. But she would do everything to save Delphine exactly as I did. The thought brought comfort and also renewed pain for his loss. Marigold came down 20 minutes later, finding Ellsworth still sitting in the armchair with closed eyes, but clearly not sleeping. She sat on the sofa across from him and waited patiently until he opened his eyes and looked at her. "Miss..." "Delphine is taking a bath," said Marigold gently. "I left clean clothes on the bed, a soft robe, and prepared a light snack in case she's hungry." Ellsworth nodded in gratitude. "Thank you, Marigold. I don't know what I would do without you," he said sincerely, and saw surprise cross her face because in 15 years he had rarely thanked her verbally, despite paying her generously. Marigold leaned forward, her hands intertwined in her lap. "Mr. Ellsworth, may I ask a question?" she said cautiously. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I need to ask." Ellsworth gestured for her to continue. "Who is she really and what happened tonight?" Marigold asked, her voice laden with genuine concern. "Why is a woman in such a state, and why did you bring her home?" Ellsworth sighed deeply, knowing that Marigold deserved the truth, at least a version of it. "I found her in a square being auctioned by her own grandson as if she were property," he said, watching Marigold's eyes widen in horror. He was desperate, must have debts with dangerous people, and decided that selling his grandmother was the solution. Marigold covered her mouth with her hand, clearly shocked. "My God, what kind of person does this to their own family?" she whispered, and Ellsworth sadly shook his head. "Someone desperate beyond any morality, someone who has completely lost their way," he said. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that she is here, and she is safe." Marigold studied him carefully. "And how much did you pay to get her out of there?" she asked, though by her tone of voice Ellsworth knew she already suspected the answer. "Everything," he said simply. "I transferred all my liquid fortune to the grandson's account." The silence that followed was absolute. "Everything," Marigold finally repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You gave all your liquid money for a stranger." Ellsworth nodded slowly. "I know how it looks. I know you must think I've gone mad or that the tumor is affecting my judgment," he said. "But I did what was necessary to help Delphine, to get her out of there, to save her from her grandson." Tears began to stream down Marigold's face, and Ellsworth realized with surprise that she was smiling through them. "You haven't gone mad," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You've finally awakened, finally become again the man you used to be before the tragedy." She stood up and approached, doing something she had never done in 15 years. She leaned over and gently kissed his forehead. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, and then moved away before emotion completely overwhelmed her. "I'll prepare tea for all of us," she said, her voice returning to its practical and efficient tone. "And tomorrow we'll figure out how to proceed with all this." Ellsworth watched her leave the room, feeling something warm expanding in his chest, something that took a moment to recognize as genuine happiness. Maybe it's not too late, he thought. Maybe there's still time to make a difference, even if it's just in one person's life. The thought brought peace that he hadn't felt in decades. The night dragged on in contemplative silence, with Marigold eventually returning with tea and biscuits that Ellsworth barely touched, due to the constant nausea the medications caused. Delphine didn't come down, and Marigold reported that she had checked and found the woman sleeping deeply in the guest room bed, still wearing the robe because she was apparently too exhausted to properly change clothes. Ellsworth decided to go up too, his own exhaustion finally demanding surrender, and Marigold helped him up the stairs with infinite patience. At the top of the stairs, he stopped in front of Delphine's bedroom door, hearing absolute silence from the other side. "Sleep well," he murmured to the closed door, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. "Tomorrow will be a new beginning for both of us." He continued to his own room, allowing Marigold to help him prepare for sleep, a ritual that had become necessary since the weakness increased. "Marigold," he said when she was about to leave, "thank you for not judging me, for accepting Delphine without questioning too much. It means more than I can express." Marigold smiled in that maternal way she had. "You gave me a job when I was desperate," she said. "Treated me fairly all these years, even being emotionally difficult. Of course I will support you now." She turned off the light and closed the door softly, leaving Ellsworth alone with his thoughts and the throbbing headache that never really disappeared. He slept heavily, dreaming of Cordelia and Anna for the first time in years without them being nightmares about the accident. Morning arrived with golden light coming through the windows, and Ellsworth woke feeling surprisingly renewed, despite the restless night. He dressed slowly, each movement still requiring effort but with less difficulty than he expected, and went down for breakfast following the smell of fresh coffee and toast. What he found in the kitchen made him stop at the entrance, completely surprised. Delphine was standing next to Marigold, wearing an apron over the clean clothes Marigold had provided, and was helping prepare breakfast with efficient movements born of decades of practice. She was beating eggs in a bowl while Marigold cut fruit, the two talking softly about something Ellsworth couldn't hear. Delphine looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, and immediately her posture became defensive again, the brief moment of normalcy evaporating. "Good morning, Mrs. Delphine," said Ellsworth gently, entering the kitchen and carefully sitting at the table. "I hope you slept well." Delphine put the bowl aside and nervously wiped her hands on the apron. "I did, thank you," she said formally, her voice still laden with uncertainty. "And I thank you for the hospitality, but now that it's morning, I need to start working to pay for my stay." Ellsworth immediately shook his head. "Ma'am, you don't need to work here," he said firmly. "I told you last night you're not an employee, you're a guest, a resident, a free person who owes nothing to anyone." Delphine looked directly at him for the first time since the square, her blue eyes full of confusion and something that could be irritation. "I am not a guest," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You bought me, paid for me, that makes me your property, or at least your responsibility." The words came out with bitterness that cut through the air like glass. Ellsworth felt each word as a physical blow. "No," said Ellsworth, rising from his chair with effort and walking until he stood in front of Delphine, looking directly into her eyes. "You are nothing of mine, not property, nor responsibility, nor obligation." He paused, choosing each word carefully because he knew this conversation would shape everything that came after. "You are my guest," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I expect nothing in return. I want no services nor gratitude, nor anything beyond knowing that you are safe and treated with the dignity every person deserves." Delphine studied him, looking for signs of falsehood or ulterior motives, and seeming genuinely confused when she found none. "Why?" she asked again, the question that clearly tormented her. "Why do all this? Give your entire fortune, bring a stranger to your home, ask for nothing in return?" Ellsworth returned to his chair slowly, suddenly feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "Because I want to help, I want to do good, and because I'm dying," he said simply, deciding that complete honesty was the only approach that would work. "I have brain cancer, inoperable tumor, 3 to 6 weeks to live at most." Delphine let out a small cry, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "When I'm gone," Ellsworth continued, ignoring her reaction, "this house and everything in it will be yours and Marigold's if you want. Marigold has instructions and paperwork to ensure that." Delphine shook her head violently, backing up until she hit the counter. "No, I can't accept this. It's too much. You don't even know me," she protested, her voice rising in panic. Ellsworth smiled sadly. "I know enough," he said. "I know you were betrayed by the person who should have protected you. I know you were publicly humiliated, but maintained dignity through it all. I know you deserve a better ending than dying alone and abandoned." He leaned forward. "And selfishly, perhaps it's good to have company at the end," he admitted. "This house is too big to die alone in it, too quiet, too empty." Delphine looked at him with wide eyes, processing everything, and then unexpectedly began to cry. Marigold immediately went to her, pulling her into a hug while Delphine sobbed against her shoulder. Years of pain and humiliation, and now confusion about unexpected kindness finally finding an outlet. Ellsworth watched in silence, feeling helpless but also hopeful that perhaps, just perhaps, he could make a real difference in someone's life before departing. When the sobs finally subsided, Delphine pulled away from Marigold and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain composure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't want to break down like that, but it's all very, very generous and very confusing." Ellsworth nodded understandingly. "You don't need to decide anything now," he said gently. "Stay today, tomorrow, as many days as you need to process everything and decide what you want to do. No one is rushing or forcing anything." Delphine nodded slowly, appearing slightly calmer. "Then at least let me help while I'm here," she said, her voice carrying a pleading tone. "I can't just sit around doing nothing. I need to feel useful somehow." Ellsworth looked at Marigold, who shrugged as if to say there was no problem in letting her help if it made her feel better. "All right," Ellsworth finally agreed. "If it makes you feel better, you can help Marigold, but as a choice, not an obligation, and you can stop whenever you want." Delphine visibly relaxed at this, as if having a defined role helped her navigate the strange situation. "Thank you," she said quietly, and then returned to the bowl of eggs, resuming where she had left off. Breakfast proceeded in more comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about this impossible new arrangement. After breakfast, Delphine disappeared without explanation, and Marigold assumed she had gone up to her room to rest or process everything in privacy. Ellsworth went to his office to check some documents he needed to sign, adjustments to his will to include Delphine as a primary beneficiary along with Marigold. He worked for a few hours, stopping frequently when the headache intensified or when his vision temporarily blurred, signs that the tumor was progressing as Cordelia had predicted. Around 2 in the afternoon, he realized he hadn't seen Delphine since breakfast, and a sudden worry struck him that perhaps she had left after all. He rose to look for her, but then remembered the security cameras installed throughout the mansion, a system he had put in years ago out of paranoia about break-ins, but rarely checked. Sitting down again, he opened the monitoring software on his computer and began to scroll through the different cameras, looking for Delphine. He found her in the library, and what he saw on the screen made him freeze completely, his heart racing as he processed the impossible scene before him. Delphine was surrounded by piles upon piles of books scattered across the floor, tables, chairs, all open to specific pages. She had an old notebook she must have found in some drawer and was writing frantically, occasionally stopping to flip through another book and read something before writing more notes. Ellsworth enlarged the image and saw the titles of the books spread around her, recognizing them immediately as the medical books that had belonged to his father, who had been a respected physician before retiring and eventually passing away. "What is she doing?" he muttered to himself, completely confused. He turned up the volume of the security system and was able to hear Delphine talking to herself as she read, her voice low but clear enough for the words to reach the sensitive microphone. "Aggressive brain tumor, glioblastoma, usually inoperable due to location and infiltration," she read aloud from one of the books. "But there must be exceptions. There must be cases where they managed to remove even those considered impossible." She quickly turned pages, her eyes scanning dense texts with impressive speed for someone her age. "Experimental treatments, immunotherapy, targeted therapy, radio frequency ablation," she continued, making rapid notes in her notebook. "Which of these could work for him? Which has the highest success rate even in advanced cases?" Ellsworth felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name as he watched this woman, whom he had saved less than 24 hours ago, completely dedicating herself to trying to save him in return. Delphine picked up another book, this one about experimental neurosurgeons and cutting-edge surgical techniques. "There has to be someone willing to try," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Someone who sees challenge instead of impossibility. Someone who understands that each life is worth fighting for, even when the chances are minimal." She wrote more notes, circled names of doctors mentioned in the book, drew connections between different treatments that could be combined. "He cannot die," she whispered, and Ellsworth saw tears beginning to fall on her cheeks. "Not after what he did for me, not when I finally found someone who saw me as a person instead of a burden." She wiped away tears impatiently and continued reading. "There must be a way, there is always a way if we search hard enough," she said with fierce determination. "I promised myself that if anyone showed me true kindness again, I would repay it with everything I have, and that's what I'm going to do." Ellsworth felt tears burning his own eyes as he watched, completely overcome by the impossible devotion of this stranger, who had become something more in such a short time. He continued observing for hours, fascinated and moved, as Delphine worked tirelessly through the medical books. At 2 o'clock she was still there, hadn't stopped for lunch. At 4 o'clock, Marigold appeared on camera carrying a tray with sandwiches and tea, clearly concerned about Delphine, but the older woman barely looked at the food, just mumbled distracted thanks and continued reading. Marigold tried to convince her to rest, but gave up when she saw the absolute determination on her face. At 6 o'clock, the natural light began to dim and Delphine turned on all the library lamps, creating a bright circle where she worked surrounded by accumulated knowledge. Ellsworth saw when she finally found something, saw how her entire body stiffened, and she leaned closer to the book, reading and rereading a specific section. "Dr. Mercer," she read aloud, "neurosurgeon specializing in cases considered inoperable, developed technique using real-time brain mapping combined with laser-guided ablation." She wrote the name in large letters in her notebook, circled it several times. 3 documented cases of success with advanced stage glioblastomas, all patients considered terminal by other specialists, she continued, her voice gaining excitement. "Clinic right here in the city, accepts urgent consultations for extreme cases." She closed the book and pressed it against her chest as if it were precious treasure. "I found it," she whispered. "I found someone who can help, someone who can save him." Ellsworth felt something break inside him, years and years of keeping emotions locked away, finally giving way under the weight of this impossible and unexpected kindness. At 8 o'clock, when the clock on the library wall marked the hour, Ellsworth could no longer just observe. He needed to go there, needed to understand why she was doing this. He rose from his office with difficulty, his legs shaking from sitting for so long and also from unprocessed emotion. He walked slowly to the library, each step deliberate and careful, his cane beating a constant rhythm against the marble floor. He stopped at the library entrance, observing Delphine for a moment before announcing himself, seeing how she was completely absorbed in her self-imposed mission, surrounded by knowledge she was desperately trying to transform into salvation. "Ms. Delphine," he finally said, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended, laden with barely contained emotion. Delphine jumped, startled, dropping some books in the process of quickly turning to face him. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her hair was disheveled from repeatedly running her hands through it, and there was a deep exhaustion on her face, but there was also something else, a burning determination that completely transformed her previous expression of defeat into something powerful. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, trying to quickly wipe her face as if embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "I didn't hear you arrive. Sorry about the mess. I'll clean everything up." She began picking up books from the floor, but Ellsworth raised his hand to stop her. "Leave the books," he said gently. "I don't care about mess, but I care about what you're doing, why you're doing it." Delphine stopped, still holding a book, and looked at him with an expression mixing defiance and vulnerability. "I'm trying to save you," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I'm looking for treatments, doctors, anything that might help." Ellsworth felt tears finally escape, the first tears he had shed in 25 years, for something other than guilt and pain. These were tears of gratitude and admiration. "Why? Why are you doing this?" he asked, echoing the question she had asked him in the square. Delphine put the book aside and walked until she was directly in front of him, her blue eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he forced himself to remain steady. "Because you saw me," she said, her voice firm despite the tears that continued to fall. "In that horrible square, with all those people laughing and filming and treating me like disposable trash, you were the only one who saw me as a person and helped me." She paused, breathing deeply to control her emotion. "You didn't have to do anything," she continued. "You could have walked by like everyone else, could have watched and left. But you chose to act, chose to sacrifice your entire fortune to get me out of there, to help me." Her voice broke. "Nobody has done anything like that for me in my entire life," she said. "Not my own son when he was alive, not my grandson who should protect me. Nobody until you appeared out of nowhere like some kind of unlikely angel." Ellsworth shook his head, uncomfortable with the comparison. "I'm not an angel," he said. "I'm just a man trying to do one good thing before I die." Delphine held his hands, squeezing with surprising strength. "Then let me return the favor," she begged. "Let me try to do one good thing for you. Let me fight for your life as you fought for my dignity." She picked up the notebook full of notes and pressed it against Ellsworth's chest. "I found something," she said, her voice gaining urgency and hope. "I found a doctor, Dr. Mercer, who performs impossible surgeries, who has succeeded where others gave up." Ellsworth took the notebook with trembling hands. "Ma'am, I have already accepted my fate," said Ellsworth gently, leafing through the pages filled with detailed notes in small but surprisingly clear handwriting. "I've made peace with death. I've adjusted my will. I've decided how I want to spend my last weeks." Delphine interrupted him, her voice rising in volume and intensity, in a way he would never have imagined possible from the broken woman he met in the square. "I haven't accepted it," she said, practically shouting now, surprising them both with the strength of her conviction. "You gave me back my dignity when I had completely given up on having it, gave me hope when my own blood betrayed me in the worst possible way." She was crying openly now, but didn't seem to care or notice. "I won't let you die without a fight," she continued, her voice breaking but not losing intensity. "Even if I have to read every book in this library, even if I have to knock on the door of every doctor in this city, even if I have to beg on my knees for someone to help." She moved closer, forcing him to really see her, to understand the depth of her determination. "You deserve to live," she said with absolute conviction. "You deserve time to be the man you chose to become when you saved me. You deserve more than a few weeks to undo 25 years of isolation." Ellsworth felt something inside him break completely, all the defenses he had built over decades crumbling under the weight of this impossible and unexpected devotion. He sat heavily in the nearest armchair, no longer trusting his legs to keep him standing, and held the notebook against his chest as if it were an anchor. "Why do you care so much?" he whispered. "You barely know me. You could just accept the house and money and live comfortably." Delphine knelt beside the armchair, placing her hands on his. "Because you saw me," she repeated. "And now it's my turn to see you, really see not the dying man, but the man who can still be saved, who can still live." She took the paper where she had written Dr. Mercer's phone number and pressed it into his hand. "We'll call tomorrow," she said, not a question but a statement. "We'll at least try. We'll fight together, just as you fought for me." Ellsworth looked at the paper trembling in his hands, at the notebook full of hope and research, at Delphine's blue eyes shining with fierce determination, and felt something he hadn't felt in 25 years, felt a desire to live. The consultation with Dr. Mercer happened the next day, with Delphine and Marigold accompanying Ellsworth in tense silence. The doctor examined the tests for long minutes before speaking. "It's an extremely complex case," he finally said. "The tumor is in a critical area. 99% of neurosurgeons would refuse without hesitation." Ellsworth felt his heart sink, but the doctor continued. "However, I've developed a technique using real-time brain mapping with guided laser ablation," he explained. "I can try to remove it while preserving vital functions." Delphine leaned forward. "What are the chances, doctor?" she asked. He was direct. 60% risk of serious complications, 30% chance of partial success giving a few extra years, 10% chance of complete removal with full recovery, he said calmly. Delphine looked at Ellsworth with fierce determination. 10% is still infinitely better than 0, she said. It's hope where there was none. Ellsworth looked at those two women who had become his family. "Let's do the surgery," he said with a firm voice. "Let's fight." The surgery was scheduled for a week later, 7 days filled with deep conversations and true connections. Ellsworth, Marigold, and Delphine spent entire afternoons in the library, sharing stories of lives lived, laughing and crying together. Ellsworth told more about Cordelia and Anna, allowing himself to remember the love instead of the guilt. Delphine shared decades of work and sacrifice ending in betrayal. Marigold revealed her own struggles, the loneliness, the distant children. They became a true family forged in the conscious choice to care. "No matter what happens," said Ellsworth on the eve of surgery, "these last weeks have been the happiest in 25 years. You have returned my humanity to me. Marigold, you've devoted yourself to me for years. I have no words to thank you for your partnership. Delphine, you saved me, didn't give up. You deserve all my recognition and gratitude. I owe a life debt to both of you. You are my family." The three cried, embracing each other, preparing for what was to come. The surgery lasted 18 hours, during which Delphine and Marigold didn't leave the waiting room, sustaining each other. When Dr. Mercer emerged exhausted but smiling slightly, they jumped up. "It was the most difficult surgery of my career," he said, "but we succeeded. We removed the tumor completely, preserved all functions." Delphine collapsed in Marigold's arms, crying with relief. "Will he recover completely?" asked Marigold. The doctor nodded. "With proper physical therapy, he'll have a normal and long life ahead," he said, "against all odds." The words echoed like a miracle. The recovery was steady, each day bringing small victories. Ellsworth woke up 3 days later, confused but alive, asking for Delphine and Marigold. They were there as promised, holding his hands. In the following weeks, he relearned to walk without a cane, regained strength completely, passed all cognitive tests. 3 months later, he was back at the mansion, not as a dying man, but reborn, literally receiving a second chance. On a sunny spring afternoon, Ellsworth gathered Delphine and Marigold in the living room, the garden exploding with flowers outside the windows. "I need to say something important," he began, his voice strong and clear. "Marigold, you served me faithfully for 15 years when I was impossible to love," he said, holding her hands. "You stood by me through the collapse, the tumor, the risky surgery, never abandoned me even when I didn't deserve it." Tears were streaming down his face. "You are family, not an employee," he said firmly. "Half of this property is yours now. Documents are already being prepared. It's not negotiable." Marigold sobbed, trying to protest, but he smiled and shook his head. Then he turned to Delphine, kneeling in front of her. "Delphine, you saved me in ways surgery never could," he said, voice breaking. "You saved me from a wasted life, from dying bitter and alone. You refused to let me give up when it would have been easier to take the money and leave." He held her hands. "The other half of the property is yours," he said. "But more than that, I want you to know that you gave me back the will to live, to be better, to honor the memory of Cordelia and Anna by living fully." Delphine cried, kissing his forehead. "You gave me dignity when I had nothing," she whispered. "You showed me there was still kindness in the world." Ellsworth stood up and embraced them both. "We are family now," he said. "Chosen family, the best kind of all." The following months brought complete transformation. The mansion that had been a mausoleum of solitude became a home full of life, laughter, and love. Marigold hired 2 young women in difficult situations to help, extending the chain of kindness. Delphine started a medicinal herb garden, finding renewed purpose. Ellsworth transformed a hall into a community library, open to all. They dined together every night, talking about the day, making plans for the future that Ellsworth now had. 1 year after the surgery, on the anniversary of his rebirth, Ellsworth hung a new photograph on the wall next to the old one of Cordelia and Anna. It was of the 3 of them together in the garden, smiling, embracing, bathed in the golden light of the sunset that seemed to bless that moment of unlikely but genuine union. Ellsworth gently touched the old frame first, his fingers tracing the contours of Cordelia and Anna's faces with reverence and longing that would never completely disappear, but was now bearable, transformed into something sweeter than bitter. Then he touched the new photograph, feeling the contrast between past and present, between what was lost and what was gained through unexpected paths. "Cordelia and Anna would be happy," he said, his voice laden with emotion but also with genuine peace, looking at both photos as if introducing one family to another across time and space. "Happy that I finally learned to live again, that I transformed pain into love, isolation into connection, that I chose to honor their memories by living instead of merely existing in perpetual guilt." Marigold and Delphine stood by his side, each holding one of his arms in a gesture of support and affection that had become natural between them. "They would be proud," Delphine said softly, her own voice breaking because she understood better than anyone the weight of that journey, how far Ellsworth had traveled from that bitter, closed-off man who saved her in the square. "Proud of the man you have become, of the home you built, of the family you chose to create." Marigold nodded, gently squeezing his arm. "You gave them the best possible gift," she said. "You continued living in a way that honors the love you shared. You didn't waste the life they couldn't have." And in that moment, surrounded by his chosen family, in a house that had become a true home filled with laughter and conversations and shared meals, Ellsworth knew, with absolute certainty, that he had finally found redemption, not through self-imposed punishment, but through love freely given and received, not through protective isolation, but through vulnerable and courageous connection. He had wasted 25 precious years in bitterness and self-recrimination, but the years to come would be lived fully, intensely, gratefully, each day a conscious celebration of the impossible second chance he received through kindness, science, and the determination of 2 extraordinary women. Life continued its inevitable course, but now he was truly living each moment instead of just waiting to die, and that difference made all the difference in the world. Now tell me in the comments where you're from, and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.